Okay, and the last few things we're gonna go through, one of them is pedigrees. So here's like a little family tree. Just important symbols you should know. Squares are males, circles are females. This horizontal line represents a mating or a marriage sometimes in a family tree. Offspring descend from the vertical lines. And if they're an affected individual for the trait we're looking at, for example, a certain disease, we shade them incompletely. If they're heterozygotes or carriers, then we shade them in halfway, like half moon. And if they don't show the traits of the disease, we have them completely blank, unfilled out. So pedigrees are best answer questions. And you'll see what that means soon. So what they ask you for pedigrees normally is they show you this kind of pedigree family tree. And they ask you essentially to figure out if this is like a certain trait. For example, for being very good at designer genes. Let's call it designer genes excellence trait. So this designer genes excellence trait, the people who are shaded in black have it. And the people who are shaded in white do not have it. And this is one kind of family tree. And so there are 4 ways we talked about inheritance. And we're going to see what they look like in each pedigree. And we're going to try to solve this together. So in an autosomal dominant pedigree, what you see is that the affected individual has an affected parent. And so this is because, again, this dominant trait is expressed whenever you have it. So if you have the trait, one of your parents had to have the trait as well. That's the characteristic of an autosomal dominant inheritance in a pedigree. In an autosomal recessive pedigree, you're going to notice that the trait of interest skips generations. Like, for example, you have the trait, your parents don't have it, but your grandparents had it. And so this is because the recessive trait, as we saw with the pea plants, it can be hidden in generations, right? Mendel saw these purple flowers. He made it a purple flower with a white flower. And when the first generation ended up with all purple flowers, but the second generation, they had white flowers return again. And so that's an autosomal recessive trait. It kind of skips generations, or it's able to do this. A sex-linked dominant trait is very rare. You would notice that an affected father has all affected daughters because when you have daughters, that means that the father is contributing an X chromosome. And the father only has one X chromosome. So if the father has the sex-linked dominant trait, then all the daughters will have it too. And in a sex-linked recessive trait like hemophilia, males are disproportionately affected. And if your mother is affected, which would mean that she has to have both of these X chromosomes have this recessive allele, then all the sons will be affected as well. But again, the most common way to identify this is that the males are disproportionately affected. So if we look at this pedigree here, let's try to rule out a few things. First of all, is it sex-linked dominant that the affected father has all affected daughters? No, because we see that this father does not have an affected daughter. So it's not sex-linked dominant. Does it skip generations? It doesn't. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not autosomal recessive. It could actually just be inherited from generation to generation. Autosomal recessive, we only know that for sure that's autosomal recessive when it skips generations. But the fact that it doesn't skip generations doesn't mean that it's not autosomal recessive, which is why we call these best answer questions. Sex-linked recessive traits, males are disproportionately affected. Are they disproportionately affected? Kind of. You can't say for sure here. It's not a really clear result. Affected sons have carrier or affected mothers. Affected mothers have all affected sons. So do the affected sons have carrier or affected mothers? Kind of here again. It's not very clear right away what's happening. And so in this case, best answer questions, you would try to go towards the most common response, which is autosomal dominant. Because you have no reason to necessarily suspect that it's autosomal recessive or sex-linked recessive. Again, we know that it's not sex-linked dominant. We cannot necessarily disprove that it's sex-linked recessive or autosomal recessive, but more likely than not then, it's autosomal dominant because we see this trait being inherited generation to generation. The males are getting it, the females are getting it. So it's probably autosomal dominant. That's the best answer question. The best answer is that it's autosomal dominant. Now we're gonna try to relate this back into the molecular components of genetics again. So we're made up of a bunch of cells in the human body. You might know that. And you might know as well that we're made up of more than one cell. So when we grow bigger, right, you see the babies are really small. Adult humans are much larger. Pea plants, when they're saplings, are very small. Grown pea plants, mature pea plants are much larger. This isn't because the cells are necessarily just getting bigger. To a certain extent, they might be, but it's mainly because the cells are dividing. And the cells are dividing, and when they're dividing, they actually need to carry their DNA, these chromosomes that we're talking about, with them. And so the cell needs to have this kind of carefully organized plan. How are we going to split the cell in two to divide, and how are we going to give it the same copy of DNA in both? So the cell cycle has 2 general components, interphase and mitosis. Interphase is just things that are not mitosis. So that's just when you're growing, you're duplicating your DNA, you're continuing to grow, you're continuing to have whatever cell activity that you have. And in mitosis is when you're actually dividing the cell. So we're going to take a closer look at mitosis. So mitosis, you have this parent cell. And in mitosis, you're going to try to duplicate this cell, but it has to have the same amount of DNA, right? If you just cut your cell in the middle, you'd lose half your DNA, and that'd be bad. But you want to have the same amount of DNA in all your cells. So first, you've already duplicated your DNA in this S phase, the synthesis phase, which happened during interphase, outside of mitosis. And then you're going to go through 4 stages: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and then we're going to have cytokinesis and split the cell. So let's quickly explain those. This is kind of all you need to know for now. So all your DNA is like kind of loose and scattered in the cell normally in the nucleus. In prophase, they're going to come out of the nucleus. They're going to condense into this characteristic, right? Everyone says they look like X's, kind of, these chromosomes. In metaphase, they're going to line up together in the middle of the cell at what's called the equatorial plate. In anaphase, they're going to pull apart to different ends of the cell, and then the cell is going to form new membranes, cleave into telophase and cytokinesis to make 2 new cells that have the same amount of DNA as the original cell. Remember, this cell here already had its DNA duplicated. So we're going to end up with cells that have the same number of DNA at the end again. And so you want to memorize this order very well: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. So I just like to think of PMAT. It just makes a lot of sense to me. PMAT is the order of going through these stages: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And you can actually see a lot of characteristics that will be shared with meiosis, which we're going to talk about in a second. So mitosis, as we said, is for growth and asexual reproduction. So you have, like, again, one division, right? You have one cell, and it's going to divide into 2. And these 2 children cells, daughter cells, are going to be genetically same as the original cell. But also sometimes you want to reproduce. So that's meiosis. So most of our cells divide by mitosis. In the reproductive system, specifically to produce sperm and eggs, for humans at least, and this is true for plants as well, except the sperm is going to be inside pollen, we're going to be going through something called meiosis. Sounds the same, not exactly the same. In meiosis, you're making gametes. Again, those are sperms and eggs for sexual reproduction. And you undergo 2 divisions, because imagine if you had just combined 2 cells together. Now they're going to have twice as much DNA. Now that'd be bad, because that means every child you had would have twice as much DNA as you would. And that would lead to all sorts of chaos that you'd want to avoid. So in meiosis, first, what you need to do is you need to have the amount of DNA in your cell. So you have your sperm and your eggs each have half of your body's DNA. And then so when they combine together, they come up to, with a normal cell again. And that's going to be your offspring. And so meiosis is cut into 2 stages. In meiosis 1, we're doing that kind of that reduction in chromosome number. That's what it's called. So normally, again, we have a pair of chromosomes. We have 2 sets of chromosomes. So 23 times 2 equals 46. In meiosis, we want to get these, divide this. So instead of having 23 pairs of chromosomes, we literally just have 23 chromosomes. Because when your sperm combines with an egg, you can get 23 pairs back and you'll have normal offspring. So again, you have prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, except they're called prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1 this time. And what we're going to see here is that this is why Mendel's laws exist. So one of the laws that we talked about was the law of segregation. And as you can see, these chromosomes are literally being segregated. They're being turned into 2, eventually 4 different gametes. So each allele can only show up in one of these gametes. That's why the alleles are segregated. You can only get one from each parent. Another law that you might remember is the law of independent assortment. So when the chromosomes line up during metaphase, metaphase 1 here, they line up randomly. So they can line up pretty much wherever, in whatever order that they want to. And because of that, the chromosomes are independently assorted, because it's just an independent chance that they assort together. And so you see the influence of those 2 laws there. Prophase, so you go through prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1, again, PMAT, and then you go through them again. And this time meiosis 2, which is what it's called, is pretty much the exact same as mitosis. We just call it meiosis 2. And you're going to end up with 4 gametes. And these are going to be the gametes you can use, these eggs or sperm, to have offspring. So you might be wondering as well, essentially, what happened to the 3rd law. So we talked about 2 laws. Independent assortment shows up in metaphase. We said the law of segregation shows up in like this anaphase, splitting the chromosomes in 2 and bringing them to different parts of the cell and then segregating them off. So that's the law of segregation. And the law of dominance, why does that exist? So again, if we go back to the entire genetic protein hypothesis, where each gene is coding for a protein, that means that normally, and this is just a generalization, it's not always true, a dominant trait is the one that is based off of the production of a protein. So for example, red hair might be dominant to white hair because red hair involves this gene for red hair producing a protein, a red colored protein that makes your hair red. Whereas white color is recessive because it's just a lack of any protein that has any color, right? If you had a gene that was an allele that had yellow hair or black hair, brown hair, blonde hair, these are all producing proteins. These are all dominant genes, and they're going to cover up this white hair allele, because this white hair allele is simply the absence of protein production, the absence of hair color. So that's where the law of dominance kind of comes from. Again, this is a generalization, but if you're guessing, that's what you'd want to go for, that the dominant gene involves the production of more things, and that the recessive allele is the absence of production.